In today's video, we're going to look at the multi-purpose stadiums that hosted both MLB and NFL teams at the same time. This is something that we used to see a lot, but is not done anymore today. The Oakland Coliseum was the last one, when it was home to the Raiders and the Athletics back in 2019. There were many stadiums over the years that had football and baseball at one time, and we still see an occasional game for college in a baseball stadium or something like that. Some of the fields have looked pretty ridiculous, but the stadiums in this video were originally built to accommodate both football and baseball, meaning they should not look as strange because the stadiums were designed with that in mind. However, most of them still did. This was a big trend from about the 1960s to the 1980s, and by the late 90s it was very outdated. Let's begin with the oldest stadium on the list, the Polo Grounds. This park has a long and complicated history. Located in New York City, the original site was not a stadium but a park that was mainly used for playing the sport polo. That's how it originally got its name, but this was back in the 1800s, and by the late 1800s they started playing baseball there. By the 1890s they played football as well. Pretty soon they decided to build stands at the park, and it became mainly used for baseball and a little football and not polo anymore. Over the years, the location of the stadium changed with the teams moving. There were several different versions and locations of the park, but the main teams playing there remained the same, most notably the New York Baseball Giants as well as the Football Giants. The final version of the stadium was finished in 1923, and for 30 years, the Giants of football and baseball shared the stadium. Many other teams played there as well over the years, and as you can see, it was a very unique place. The stadium had a shape that seemed much better fit for football, but it still looked very weird. At times, the stands would be brought closer to the field for football, and other times there would be large gaps between the seats and the playing field. There was also sometimes the infield on the field of play for football. For baseball, the dimensions were crazy. It was very short to the outfield corners and then super long to dead center field. In fact, it was over 450 feet to hit a home run to dead center. The New York Jets also played there for a few years. Sadly, the Polo Grounds was closed in 1963 and demolished in 1964. Up next is Cleveland Municipal Stadium. Located in Cleveland, Ohio, this stadium opened in 1931 and was designed to host both MLB and NFL games. I know it looks much more like a baseball stadium, but the first team to play there was actually the Cleveland Indians of the NFL. Yes, in 1931 there was an NFL team called the Cleveland Indians who played there, and the following year, in 1932, the Cleveland Indians of Major League Baseball moved in. The Indians football team only lasted that 1 year, but several years later the Cleveland Rams football team and then in the 40s the Cleveland Browns played there. The baseball team played there for 2 seasons and then briefly moved out after complaints about the outfield being too large. But after briefly playing back at League Park, they returned to Cleveland Stadium. For many years, the Indians and Browns shared the stadium. For baseball, it looked pretty normal aside from part of the outfield walls looking sort of temporary. This was probably to address the too large outfield problem, and for football, some of the walls were taken down there. But for football, it looked very strange. The main thing was all the extra space along the sidelines. It clearly looked like there was just a football field inside of a baseball stadium. It's hard to believe that the stadium was designed for both football and baseball, but believe it or not, it was. By the 90s, the stadium had become outdated. The Indians moved into their new home, Jacobs Field, in 94, leaving just the Browns to play there. But just a short time later, in 95, the Browns moved to Baltimore and became the Ravens. Cleveland Stadium was then demolished, and the Browns' current home was built on the site, so when they became a team again, they had a nicer stadium. Milwaukee County Stadium opened in 1953 as the home of the Milwaukee Braves MLB team. It also was the home to several Green Bay Packers home games each season. The Packers would play a few games down in the Milwaukee area every year. This park was mostly just a baseball field, and it did not look like there was a whole lot of design effort that went into football, because as you can see, once again there was a ton of open space on the sidelines. Also, the way the field was positioned at the angles it's at in the stadium looks really weird from afar. One of the corners of the end zone is almost cut off. When the Braves moved out, for 5 years the stadium did not have an MLB team, other than when the White Sox played some games there as an experiment. In 1970, the Brewers arrived though. The Packers continued to play a few games there each year until 1994, then they played full-time at Lambeau Field ever since. Looking at this, I don't know if this fully qualifies to be on the list, but I decided to include it anyways. The Packers were just there part-time, and the stadium was really just a baseball field, but the Packers did play there from the very time it opened, so it had to have been at least some part of the design of the stadium to include some football. The Brewers played there until 2000 and then moved into Miller Park the following year. In the 1960s, the so-called cookie-cutter time period started. The name cookie-cutter comes from many stadiums in the same time period being multi-use and looking the same. Many MLB and NFL teams were already sharing stadiums, but it was generally NFL teams playing in a baseball stadium designed for baseball, so it never looked ideal. Even in the rare instances of the places that we've looked at so far, they've all still looked really odd. So they started designing stadiums for practical reasons and not as much for cool designs. They were designing them to fit both baseball and football. And in 1961, RFK Stadium opened in Washington, D.C. This was one of the first cookie-cutter looking stadiums. It was designed to be home of both the Senators of MLB and the Redskins of NFL. The result was a very round-looking stadium that had seating all the way around it. The idea was that it would maximize the seating for football games and not have weird spaces with no seating opportunities. For football, some seats could be put in place that would eliminate the large gaps of nothing you would often see along the sidelines. And it worked well for football, but baseball suffered. It is said that Redskins owner George Preston Marshall liked the stadium, but Senators owner Calvin Griffith did not. As you can see in the outfield, the upper deck seats were not very popular, and it's not generally a well-liked design. Plus, below that, beyond the outfield, the entire area was kind of just a wall. The Senators ended up playing there and sharing with the Redskins until 1971, when they moved to Texas and became the Rangers. Now the Redskins played there until 96 and then got a new stadium. It was then used for mostly soccer. Then years later in 2005, the Montreal Expos moved to DC and became the Nationals. For 3 seasons they played at RFK, which was now old and outdated. After they moved out, RFK has hosted some soccer, but was mostly abandoned for years until it started to get demolished in recent years. A few years later in 1964, Shea Stadium opened in Queens, New York. This has mainly been known as the home of the New York Mets, but it was also the home of the New York Jets when it opened. The stadium was designed to host both baseball and football. As you can see, this park also had a very round design. However, it was open at the end where the outfield was. For baseball, it worked pretty well, and it was always strange to see hardly any outfield seats and the giant scoreboard. For football, it was even weirder though. It certainly seems like football was an afterthought. Absolutely 0 seats at one end zone with random open space. Then 3 decks for about the entire other half of the stadium. They later added some seats in the end zone, but there was still a little bit larger than usual amount of open space on the sidelines. Strange, but they made it work. The Jets played there until '83, and the Mets played there all the way until 2008. It was demolished soon after. In 1965, Atlanta Fulton County Stadium opened. After the Braves that we talked about earlier moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta, they got a new stadium. Atlanta was also getting an NFL team with the Falcons, so this brand new stadium would be home to both teams starting in 1966. For the first year, it hosted just minor league baseball. This stadium, much like RFK, was a rounded, closed design, and you'll notice it looks pretty similar to RFK as well. Sure, there were some minor differences, but at the end of the day, they're very close. Basically 2 decks all the way around and a little bit of open space on the sidelines, but nothing crazy. It is a practical design that worked, and the Falcons and Braves shared for about 25 years. In the 90s, however, the Falcons moved into the Georgia Dome, and several years later, the Braves got a new ballpark as well. Atlanta Fulton County Stadium then closed and was demolished in 1997. Also in 1965, a groundbreaking new stadium opened. It was the Houston Astrodome, which was the very first indoor stadium for both the NFL and MLB. It was designed to be multi-purpose and get an NFL team. First though, it was the home to the brand new Houston Astros MLB team. They had played their first few seasons as the Houston Colt 45s in an outdoor temporary stadium. With the Texas heat and rain and overall weather conditions, Houston built the first ever domed stadium. When it opened, it was truly amazing. There was natural grass inside, and the light would shine through the panels on the ceiling, allowing the grass to grow. However, the players were irritated with the color of the roof, so the panels were painted. This caused the grass to die, and they ended up playing on a field of all dirt and just painted some of the dirt green where there would be grass. So in the second season of the stadium, they knew they couldn't keep doing that, and they invented artificial grass, which is called AstroTurf and later just turf. This allowed them to play inside without having to grow the grass. The Astrodome then got the Houston Oilers as an NFL team in 1968. The Oilers and Astros shared for many seasons. As for the overall design of the Astrodome, if you take away the roof, it looks awfully similar to RFK and Atlanta's Cookie Cutter Park. Another round design with two basic decks. By the end of the 90s, the Oilers moved out into Tennessee and became the Titans, and the Astros got a new park. The Astrodome has since sat mostly vacant. But with the invention of a domed stadium as well as turf, several other places imitated their designs. Turf became extremely popular for multi-use stadiums because with double the use, plus in some cases moving seats around to accommodate different sports, natural grass would get worn down. Turf did not break down like grass, and it became very popular and practical for them to use. Opening in 1966 was the Oakland Coliseum. This was built to host both baseball and football, and at first the design was a little different. It was very round but more open with just one level of seats at one end where the outfield is. The Raiders played there for 2 seasons before the Athletics joined them. For football, a large temporary seating area was put in and it looked kind of strange. For baseball, there was always a large amount of foul ground. Later on, the Raiders left in 81 and then came back again in 95. And then came back in 95. A renovation was done and a giant upper deck was added in the 90s. These teams would share the stadium all the way until 2019. It was the last stadium to be multi-use for both MLB and NFL. It was always funny to see the infield dirt of a baseball game during a football game. And for the last decade plus of the park, it was in rough shape. The stadium was old, outdated, and viewed as one of the worst in the league for both leagues. The large upper deck was hardly used for either sport and often closed entirely for baseball. The Raiders moved to Las Vegas in 2020, and the Athletics left Oakland after the 2024 season. Today, it's still there and hosts a few different things. The following year in '67 in San Diego, Qualcomm Stadium opened. It was known then as San Diego Stadium and later Jack Murphy Stadium. It was designed to host the San Diego Chargers of the NFL, but also get an MLB team to the area. This stadium does look somewhat like the other cookie cutter parks, but to me not so much. It is less rounded, and to me it also feels more like a football stadium than baseball. When it first opened, similar to Shea Stadium and Oakland Stadium, it was more open at one end. In 1968, the Padres began playing there, their first year as a minor league team, and then from then on as a major league club. There were multiple decks the rest of the way around the stadium. It was later renovated and the decks were brought all the way around. For a time period, it did look really strange for football, as you can see here, but later on it looked much more normal. For baseball though, the position of the scoreboard reminds you that it's a football stadium. You can see how it lines up with the end zones. This stadium became very outdated though. By the early 2000s, the Padres moved out and got their own field. The Chargers continued to play there until 2016 when they relocated up the road to LA for some reason. Qualcomm was known in its final years as being outdated and having bad scoreboards. It was demolished in 2020. In 1970, 2 very similar stadiums opened. The first is Three Rivers Stadium. It opened to be the home of the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Pittsburgh Steelers. The teams had played at Forbes Field and shared, but Forbes was a baseball park and the Steelers had been playing at Pitt Stadium in the late 60s. Three Rivers was designed to have both teams. As you can see, the design was very rounded. They also used artificial turf, which made sense for the playing surface so it didn't get worn down. It worked well for hosting both sports. Only minor changes were needed to go from football to baseball and baseball to football. But the design became very outdated by the 90s. Many fans didn't like the lack of character or uniqueness. So both teams played there from 1970 to 2000. Then, both at once, they got their own new stadium very close by. Three Rivers was then demolished in '01. Also in 1970, Riverfront Stadium opened in Cincinnati. This was the home to both the Reds of MLB and the Bengals of the NFL. To talk about this stadium, I feel like I would just be repeating myself. A rounded design with a couple of decks and artificial turf. It also had River in the name. And these teams played there for almost the same exact time period as the Steelers and Pirates as well. The Bengals played there from 1970 to 1999, and the Reds from 1970 to 2002. In the final years of this park, though, they opened it up in center field, but that was just to accommodate the construction of the new park. They also added natural grass for the Reds, which was a little better, I guess. In 1971, just 1 year later, Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia opened. You can see just how much of a trend these stadiums were at the time. Slightly less rounded, this stadium was the home to both the Phillies and the Eagles. It also had artificial turf and had 2 main decks all the way around. I've never really seen a ton of fans who want to sit in this area right here for baseball. I'm wondering what the cost of a ticket for that area was. The Eagles played there until 2002 and the Phillies played there until 2003. Then in 2004 the park was demolished. Both teams moved to outdoor stadiums with natural grass. In 1976 the Kingdome opened in Seattle. It was the second domed indoor stadium to be used for both MLB and NFL at the same time. The Seahawks moved in 1976 and the Mariners moved in the following season. Both the Seahawks and the Mariners were brand new teams to the area and this was their first home. It was another round stadium, shocker, and for baseball it does look fairly similar to the Astrodome. There was artificial turf, and for football we saw at times a bit much open space. The first years of the park it was good, but quickly people realized the problems. There was a lack of natural light and just too much of an indoor artificial feel. By the 90s it was outdated. Both teams played there until 99 and then got their own parks. In 1982, the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome opened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Vikings of the NFL and the Twins of MLB had already been sharing for years. They had played at Metropolitan Stadium, which was outdoors with natural grass. But that park had been designed just for baseball and football was added on later. It looked really strange for football, and with the harsh Minnesota winters, they took notes from Houston and Seattle. The stadium was also a dome with artificial turf. It was designed to be multi-use, and they had an interesting way of going about it. It was sort of a football stadium first instead of baseball, and most other stadiums seem to be baseball first. As you can see, for football everything seems to be lined up pretty well. It may seem a bit bland, but there's no random open spaces or seats facing the wrong way or anything. Then all they would do is move back the seats along one sideline for baseball. But for Twins games, the entire right field had a giant baggie beyond the outfield wall, and you can see seats in storage, which is kind of a bad look. They would also cover up half the upper deck with a giant poster. By the 2000s, it was very outdated, but both teams continued to share until 2009. Then the Twins moved out, and several years later, the Vikings moved out. The dome was demolished in 2014. Finally, in 1987, Robbie Stadium opened in Miami, Florida. This stadium was the last one to be designed as multi-purpose for both football and baseball. It was designed to host both sports, even though Miami did not have an MLB team yet. Owner Robbie believed it was just a matter of time, and he was right, although it took a few years. In '87, the stadium opened, and just the Dolphins played there. It really looks like just a football stadium and not MLB at all. But later on in the early 90s, when Miami did get an MLB team with the Marlins, they moved in. For baseball, it seemed kind of weird, but it worked. It was certainly more normal for football. Attendance was always a problem for baseball in Miami, and sometimes the upper deck was closed off. Also, the seats in center were always closed because of the batter's eye. The scoreboard locations are also really strange for baseball, but for football they worked with one at each end zone. The Marlins moved out in 2012 and got their own park. Similarly to the Metrodome, this park looked like a football stadium with baseball just playing in it. In 2015, there was a large renovation, and the stadium looked very different after, and the Dolphins continue to play there today. But now, it's just used for football and is called Hard Rock Stadium. That's all for today's video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.